Hello, and welcome to another episode of Thoroughly Thriving, where talent meets strategy and innovation drives success. On today's episode, we will take a deep dive into the world of human capital solutions, explore the latest trends in recruitment, and share actionable insights to help businesses grow and thrive. Whether you're a seasoned executive, a budding entrepreneur, or just passionate about the future of work, you are in the right place. Well, let's get started on building the future one conversation at a time.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Thoroughly Thriving. We're really excited for today's episode. Darren, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm really expectant, and I'm looking forward to speaking with our guest today, Sean.
Yeah, it's going to be a good one. We're really excited, especially given the current landscape with the FDA and everything that's happening in drug development and investing and small companies and large companies. And there's a lot of moving parts and pieces happening in our world. And so we wanted to bring on somebody that we really view as a thought leader and somebody who's really, built an incredible career in leading companies in the regulatory space. And so we wanted to invite our friend Jill Herendeen on today. Jill, welcome to Thoroughly Thriving.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, before we dive into some of our discussion today, I just want to give our audience a little background on who you are and why we'd love to have you on today. For any of you who don't know Jill, she's really a seasoned regulatory professional with over 2 decades of experience in drug development, specializing largely in oncology therapeutics, but really a big track record of global approvals and a commitment to novel drugs that focus on the unmet needs, which, man, Jill, I love that. I think that's really a great passion. And so you've worked in all phases of life cycle management, early phase, late phase, post marketing, across all sorts of small molecules and biologics and cellular therapies, companion diagnostics. It's pretty incredible how much you've been able to work and have your hands involved in with different facets of like regulatory science and PV and operations and QA and program management and you began your career at a company like Amgen and really, I'm sure, learned a ton, but then you've also been able to work across companies like BMS and Pharmacyclics and Silverback Therapeutics and Orca Bio. I mean, what a great group of organizations that you've really played a key role in developing the growth of their programs and the future where they're going. And most recently, actually launched your own consulting firm in the regulatory space called Rubicon Consulting, which is awesome that you're able now to add value to multiple companies and be able to jump in the areas that you're most passionate about. So for those of you who don't know, Jill is an incredible resource in regulatory space. And, we've known each other for years. I would highly recommend her, for many of the companies that are all over, not just the West Coast, but United States and even the world. So Jill, thank you so much for joining us today. And Darren and I are excited because we want to jump in and talk a little bit about some different aspects of regulatory affairs. I think it's really an important aspect of things. And, we're really excited to give our audience the opportunity to hear some wisdom on your end. Darren, I don't know, what are you thinking about today?
Yeah, Sean, really good intro, which encapsulates, I'm sure, a lot, but not all of Jill's background. So, again, looking forward to taking a deeper dive. Jill, as we kind of think about the regulatory landscape, right, which is ever more challenging than it has been. And we here at Thorough Group work with a lot of emerging biotechs, medical device companies, and we're often asked, guys, given your depth and breadth of experience, what advice do you have for us, especially for those early phase, early stage based companies? And they ask us our opinion on, can you give us some context? Can you give us some color on what you see working out there from a roadmap, from systems? What advice could you give us? So, just to kind of kick things off, we're curious, what advice would you give to our early phase company that's looking for a regulatory pathway?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. I spent the last 6 years working at various startups, and that had different phenotypes but similar needs. But the most important thing, I think, the end goal always remember and remind your C-suite and the team there what the end goal is, right? You're developing novel therapies for your unmet need. At least that's kind of my sweet spot, as Sean alluded to. So, beginning with the end in mind is really important in terms of how you create the regulatory roadmap or the strategic regulatory plan. And I think when you work with these startups, that all sounds well and good, but how do you actually implement it, and how do you do it in a fit for purpose manner that manages their they have a certain runway, financial runway that they have to work within. And so that's where I think oftentimes you don't need a full suite of a regulatory leader for, potentially you don't need to bring in-house staff necessarily right away. It waxes and wanes. The regulatory needs wax and wane as you get towards IND enabling studies, and then ultimately your first application, your first IND, at least in this country, or a CTA ex US. So you want to make sure that you're asking the right questions and understanding the right regulatory context in terms of how you message your story and your data, you present your data, and you have systems to support presentation of your data. But they can be done in a fit for purpose manner as you develop that IND dossier originally, or you're working to put together the application ex US to get your asset into clinic. Sometimes startups will come to me even well before candidate selection and want before when they're going through some different target prioritization, candidate selection prioritization exercise, and they just want to get a high level overview of the regulatory landscape. That's another area, like pulmonary hypertension versus another inflammatory disease area, or like Crohn's disease, or they want to understand what the landscape looks like from a regulatory standpoint. Where are the unmet need, and before, or just in general, what does the class effect look like in terms of the regulatory landscape? So all those, I don't mention that because that all encompasses the regulatory strategy, depending on where the asset or the program is in its development life cycle.
Yeah. No, thank you. That's good. I like how you started with the end in sight because, Jill, we oftentimes, right, the professionals, the experts, the key opinion leaders that we get to work with, it's easy sometimes to have a very myopic perspective on things, right, and just work in the set parameters. So when you can both zoom out and remind everyone that we're lockstep, we're working towards this goal, but these are the things that we need to be aware of. I think that's really good that you can then zoom in.
Yeah, there's a couple terms that regulatory scientists like to use that can kind of throw people off sometimes, but it really is with the intention of beginning with the end in mind, like I just mentioned. And it's even once you select your candidate to go into clinic and you're developing your preclinical data set to your IND enabling studies, really understanding what that target label looks like so that you can have that cross functional dialogue. Even though most startups don't have in-house regulatory, they definitely don't have in-house commercial, that you want to have that cross-fertilization talk around these functions so that these functions are represented in terms of the development goals, the development, where we are, where's the strategic direction, where do we want this drug to ultimately end up in terms of the patient, serving patients, how is it going to address the unmet need? And those conversations can encompass commercial need, formulation need, line of therapy need, competitive landscape need, the magnitude of treatment effect need. All these things play into the target label, and those conversations are really important to begin with the end in mind. So they don't have to be really fancy, and they don't have to have all these fancy templates. They could just be a simple slide initially to just try to understand where the program is going.
Yeah. Um, you just touched upon commercialization, and your experience is very comprehensive and vast, which makes for a very, very engaging and intriguing podcast. I know our listeners are gonna. I'm already enjoying this. But I'm going to pass it over to Sean. Maybe we could touch upon the role that plays in commercialization.
Yeah, no, I love Julia said, and it's funny because the shoe can fit in a variety of arenas. I was just thinking as you were talking about, Darren and I launched our company, a little over a year, or I guess right about a year ago. And, it was just really interesting because we've had to make a lot of those similar decisions with the end in mind and really kind of working through and working backwards from a big picture down to micro, then back to macro. But it is so relevant in what you were talking about. And I love what you said about small companies don't have regulatory or even commercial, right? Obviously at that point. But I love that your mindset is always full cycle, right? You're thinking full product life cycle when you're leading through a specific area. What are some of the ways in your experience that the role of regulatory plays in that commercial preparation, number one, but also just as a whole in the product cycle. Like how can regulatory work best with every functional area, even including manufacturing and other things like that within the development life cycle?
Well, as we all know, the biopharmaceutical industry is highly regulated, right? So the regulatory plays a role across the spectrum of the development life cycle of an asset, an investigational asset, from the time the candidate asset is selected all the way through to commercialization. And I refer to that spectrum as the life cycle, the development life cycle. But even in the life cycle management post marketing setting, that in some respects that's where regulatory really picks up, because the burdens of the reporting requirements that are front and center in the post marketing setting. There, as I mentioned earlier with Darren, there are touch points where things can wax and wane, right? The IND enabling work, getting the IND submitted. That there's a heavily regulatory presence there. Responding to agency questions. That's usually for a lot of these startups. That's the inflection point that they need some real tractionable support for. Um, but then one of the critical time points in a regulatory life cycle of a investigational drug, and throughout the life cycle, is when you're meeting with health authorities globally to align on your registration plan. In the US, we call that the end of phase one or end of phase two meeting, depending on the disease setting and the area of unmet need. And then you have multiple inflection points across the life cycle where you're meeting with the regulators to align on strategy, whether it be collection of data, whether it be study design elements, whether it be requirements for commitments post marketing. All these things come to bear and are part of the overall regulatory roadmap or strategy. And then post marketing, in some cases, you know, there are lots of the literature is littered with examples of where we didn't really learn enough about the drug until it got into the post-marketing setting, and that's where regulatory again becomes front and center. Understanding the safety signals with once it gets a broader exposure, especially this is very common in oncology. Once you have a broader exposure, either the confirmatory studies don't read out, or you find a new safety signal that you didn't learn in your clinical trial program. So all these things, regulatory is front and center and a touch point, as this is a highly regulated industry, and I view regulatory as the ambassador of the company to the regulators to really defend and justify, and put our data in context, the sponsor's data in context, whether that be as a consultant or whether as that be as an employee. It really, your job is to form the narrative, understand the data, put the data in context for the clinical context and the non-clinical context, and in the commercial context as well, across the realm.
Oh, I love that term ambassador because my experience has been, great regulatory leaders are ambassadors kind of both directions, right? They are an ambassador internally, with really maintaining a level of excellence, vision, direction, and understanding the bigger picture, but then externally making sure that, all of the appropriate authorities have the full picture of what you're doing and where you're going and what the plan is. And I love that because I just think it's such a great representation of, great leaders who, who are really carrying the flag, so to speak, that they're championing, what they're doing top down. And I think that's pretty amazing work that you've done. Is there anything in particular you would advise for ways that regulatory can best work toward commercial preparation, as a part of the manufacturing piece, as a part of really thinking through into the future? Because I know a lot of the people in our audience are listening, and they're at different phases of development, and they're really thinking through a variety of different aspects. And to your point, it's got to be fit for purpose. So now they're scaling to this place. Is there any key thoughts you have for this side, portion of development?
You mean in terms of the later stage,
Yeah.
um, post proof of concept, clinical proof of concept?
Yep.
Um, Again, I think the underlying very common denominator is begin with the end in mind. Make sure that you understand where you're going, that everyone in the company and your external stakeholders are aware of your strategic goals and where the overall objective is, where we want this to go. It is always helpful when you are working with people that have been through a commercial launch and understand the implications and the payer implications, the uptake and integration into the landscape, what the commercial uptake looks like, understanding the different market access boundaries and challenges and opportunities. Um, all those things are really important. Understanding the regulatory requirements, depending on the scope of the approval in this country. In the US, there's different regulatory requirements from a promotional standpoint for an accelerated approval versus a full approval, and there are very different parameters ex-US in that realm. But the most important thing, and I want to really highlight this in today's discussion, is you be data driven, because your data will tell you the story. The data will your job as my ambassador, just to use that metaphor again, I'm a diplomat. My job is to put that data in context, but no one can put data in context if you don't understand it. And so understand your data, follow the data, just like follow the money, follow the data, and the data will lead you to where it needs to go. That is there nuances around that? Of course, there's strategy, there's different touch points, like I mentioned before, with the regulators, where you get their feedback, and that may modify certain elements of how you would go forward in your path. But I think ultimately, your relationship with internal and external stakeholders and that includes investors, are going to be much more fruitful and productive if you are data driven in your narratives.
Very, very true. And as you're talking about relationships, one of the things that I love when we were talking about just, preparing for this podcast is the idea of collaboration is such a big deal to you. Darren, I know, given the existing, regulatory health authority landscape, even here in the US, is a little bit unique right now. Darren, I don't know if you read anything about that recently, but
Yeah. To go back to the ambassador aspect, Jill, I think it's also part of being an ambassador is being a good collaborator. And so, can you speak to how you've collaborated with the FDA, perhaps some of the nuances that you're seeing in the current landscape, and what that road ahead may look like for these early stage, early phase clients?
Yeah, I'm just going to start by saying we are so fortunate to live in this country where we have an agency that is protecting the safety and effectiveness, is really safe as public servants, safeguarding the safety and effectiveness of new medicines and existing medicines that are currently on the market, and food as well. We are FDA is, this is not contentious. This is not debatable. It is a fact. They are the gold standard for public health oversight for food and drug, and we are very fortunate to live in a country where we have that. That said, there is an incestuous relationship with the industry, the biopharmaceutical industry, because the user fees pay for a lot of the FDA salaries and infrastructure. So, there is a lot of talk around what that looks like, and how that can be modified in today's current political climate. FDA is being, there, to put it mildly, disrupted. There's a lot of chaos and disruption going on. Sometimes that disruption is positive, sometimes it can be negative. It's too soon to tell, but I can tell you that with any kind of disruption, again, back to strategy, there needs to be a strategic strategy behind what's the source of the disruption. And is it for the good, to reconfigure, to reorganize, to have better outcomes, to add some efficiencies? I'm all for that. But for all intents and purposes, what I'm seeing from the outside is there is no necessary order to the disruption. It's a little chaotic. So it's too soon to tell what this is going to look like in the future. But what I can tell you is the FDA, as they are thought leaders, they are scientific. They hire people from across the globe for their scientific expertise. And they're wonderful collaborators, and they're very data driven. So in my experience working with them, I feel so privileged and honored to work with the scientists at FDA on multiple drugs. I've worked with them over the years. Their friendships, their professional friendships, partnerships, collaboration, technical expertise, advice. I mean, they really have moved the needle for drug innovation. And without that, we wouldn't be where we're at now, with the number of approvals that they have done, like just last year alone. Every year they break records, and they need to be recognized that way.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Um, I really appreciate that perspective of locking arms instead of looking at it as an obstacle or hurdle. And it's good to kind of level set where the FDA is comparatively to other regulatory agencies around the globe.
They set the tone. There was a publication recently, just by Friends of Cancer Research, that came out and talked about, kind of dispelled a lot of rumors about the FDA not meeting their review guidelines and not meeting timelines. And by and large, they're not only meeting them, but they're beating them. And they are for the most companies, they file their applications in the US first, and then the FDA approval precedes any subsequent follow-on approval, variation, or marketing authorization in other regions. So people are piggybacking on FDA's work when they review applications in other regions, and that's the case for at the IND level as well. People piggyback on FDA's review before, but oftentimes, I can't tell you how many times I've gone in with an IND review and gotten questions, and they want to see copies of the FDA comments from in other countries, because they want to see how FDA is thinking about a specific issue. So when I say gold standard, I mean they set the gold standard.
Well, Jill, I mean, it's been an honor and a privilege to talk through a lot of this today, and I love your perspective. As we were talking the other day about it, just, this understanding of working together, this understanding of just a thankfulness. And I know Darren and I are thankful as well, for the work that is put in by the FDA week in and week out. We're on the other end as consumers, for a lot of those products and treatments and, other things that wouldn't otherwise be there. And so, we're really, really thankful for that. And also, honestly, thankful for your time as well. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you. I know this is only brief. We could do a 2 hour podcast if we wanted to, just to really open up and have some real conversations. So we may have to have you back again. But, for our audience and for our listeners, we will include the link to Jill's website for Rubicon Consulting if you'd like any more information on that as well, as a summary of some of her background. Jill, we want to thank you for joining us today. It's been such a privilege and an honor to have you. And we like to close out our podcast every episode by reminding ourselves that we only remain thoroughly thriving in every area because we work as one and we win as one. Thank you for joining us on today's episode. Have a great rest of your week. Thank you for joining us today for another great episode of Thoroughly Thriving. If you enjoyed today's episode, please feel free to share it with those in your world. If you'd like to learn more about the Thorough Group, please go to thoroughgroup.com. And remember that we will all remain thoroughly thriving if we continue to work as one and win as one.